Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 54th deck and it's called What If We Took Your Library and Pushed It Somewhere Else? And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is we are randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So really quickly, before we get into the actual deck tech itself, I do want to highlight some of our social media accounts. If you are interested in following us over on Twitter, following us over on Reddit, sending us an email, all of these places are great places to interact with us, maybe ask us some questions, or if you're looking to suggest a card or a deck for this channel, those are some great places to do it, as well as, of course, the comments to this video. If you are looking to support our content a little more directly, you can always use our affiliate code with TCG Player. We do have a link there that you can use if you're ever buying any cards. We get a little bit of kickback from them, so we do appreciate any cards you purchase through our link. And then if you wanted to support us even more directly, you can head on over to our Patreon. And over there, we give access to the decks a little bit early, access to the videos a little bit early. We even give access to videos that are completely unedited. So if you're interested in hearing what any of the players are saying or our commentary throughout the game, that is a great way to do it. Plus, you get a little bit of extra feedback to give us on the decks. So if that's something you're interested in, all of that money right now is going toward finding a way to record in-person games. So that way we have a little bit of both on the channel. And if none of those are your style, you can, as always, like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment, let us know what you think. All of that does help out quite a bit. So thank you to everyone for all of your support. And before we get into the deck tech, we do have one last thing to do. I have a quick shout out, and in this case, it's going to be MikAG3 Productions. This is a good friend of mine. He and I have been playing Magic for a few years together now, and he recently had me as a guest over on his Twitch channel for the MikAG3 meetup. In this case, it was this past Friday, so I know it's over on his Twitch channel. He is working on getting it posted to his YouTube channel as well. So if you are interested, he's a great guy. He does streams every Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday. Some of them are art where he draws for a comic book that he's working on. Other times it's fighting games, and he's debating on bringing Magic back to the channel as well. So please give him some support. He's an awesome person, makes some amazing content, and I'm very happy to have been able to guest on his channel recently. So those are our shout outs for the week. And I suppose, without any further ado, let's get into our actual deck for this week. And our random card for the week was a suggested card, this time by David Desantis over on YouTube. And the card is a card that's very interesting to me. I've always found this card to be very up my alley for what I want to do, even though it never quite works for me. And that is Mirko Vosk, Mind Drinker. So Mirko Vosk is 3 blue, black for a legendary creature vampire. He's a 2/4 with flying. And whenever Mirko Vosk Mind Drinker deals combat damage to a player, that player reveals cards from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals 4 land cards, then puts those cards into his or her graveyard. Now, as we always do with this show, if we get a legendary creature as our random card, that means we got to make them the commander. So this week we are playing Mirko Vosk. We got Dimir, we got a vampire, we got an evasive commander, and a bit of a mill theme. So since we have a little bit of a spoiler for our first major theme, let's check out what the rest of our themes look like. And of course, we got to start with the one that's already been spoiled. We are a mill deck. We want to take our opponent's graveyards and turn them into their libraries, essentially. We want to, I said that wrong, didn't I? We want to take their libraries and put them into their graveyards. Boy. So what that means, though, is we are taking cards directly off the top of their deck and putting them into the graveyard, hopefully, meaning that our opponents can't use them. Yes, I know there are ways that they can kind of make use of their own graveyards, but we have a ton of ways to put a ton of cards in there all at once, and this is essentially our win condition as well, because if someone tries to draw a card from a library that has no cards in it, they just lose the game. So that is where cards like Fleet Swallower come in, which is 5 blue for a 6/6 creature fish. Whenever Fleet Swallower attacks, target player puts the top half of his or her library rounded up into his or her graveyard. So we can essentially mill someone for half of their deck every time we go to combat, which doesn't seem super great once they get fewer and fewer cards in their deck, but if we hit someone who has 80 cards, that's just 40 right into the graveyard, which is much better than most of our cards could do. So Fleet Swallower is a great example of what we're aiming to do in this deck. But we of course can't just count on milling our opponents and doing nothing else. We do need to do some other things with this deck. So our next major theme is cards that care about our opponent's graveyards being full. So for example, we have Nighthawk Scavenger, which is 1 black for a creature, vampire, rogue. Its power is 1+*, and its toughness is 3, and it has flying, death touch, and lifelink. And Nighthawk Scavenger's power is equal to 1 plus the number of card types among cards in your opponent's graveyards. So that includes things like instants, sorceries, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, planeswalkers, tribal, land, all of that stuff. So that means our Nighthawk Scavenger could be, if we hit everything, a massive 8/3 flying death touch lifelink. So the more cards we have in our opponent's graveyard, the better some of our cards become. And Nighthawk Scavenger is a great example of that, because nobody wants to block a flying death toucher anyway, but if it's a flying death toucher with 8 power that's also gaining us 8 life, our opponents are going to have to deal with it. And if they're dealing with this, that means that they're not dealing with our Fleet Swallower, or they're not dealing with Mirko Vosk, and it essentially lets us kind of just keep going. And then, finally, our third theme, since we're filling our opponent's graveyards anyway, we might as well take some things for ourselves. So, for example, we have Lorcan Warlock Collector, 5 black for a legendary creature devil. That's a 6/6 with flying. Whenever a creature card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, that does include the library, you may pay life equal to its mana value. If you do, put it onto the battlefield under your control. It's a warlock in addition to its other types. If a warlock you control would die, exile it instead. So Lorcan allows us to mill over our opponents, and without paying any mana, we just have to pay life, which if we have an 8-power Nighthawk Scavenger, shouldn't be too much of a problem. We can put any creature that we mill into our opponent's graveyards directly into play under our control. Yeah, if they die, then they get exiled, but they weren't ours in the first place, so we're not really that concerned. And Lorcan is not the only reanimation effect we have, so we have tons of ways of getting creatures out of our own graveyard, creatures out of our opponent's graveyard, because if we're milling over our opponent's stuff, there's a good chance we're going to hit something good, and we want to be able to take advantage of that. So these are our major themes for the deck. We're aiming to fill our opponent's graveyard and then make use of it for us to be able to win the game. And so to that end, we do have a couple of key cards in this deck, some cards that synergize very well with those themes that we just talked about. The first of which is going to be Into the Story, which is very expensive for a card draw spell, considering it is 5 blue, but it is an instant, and the key text on this says this spell costs 3 less to cast if an opponent has 7 or more cards in their graveyard. Draw 4 cards. So if any opponent has 7 or more cards in their graveyard, this becomes 4 mana, instant speed, draw 4 cards, which is incredibly powerful because we want to hold up our mana most of the time anyway. We have a ton of little flash creatures, we have a ton of instant speed interaction, we have a ton of artifacts and creatures that can be activated for mana at instant speed. So being able to hold up interaction, and then if we don't need to use it, flash this in at the end of turn, draw 4 cards, refill our hand, and keep the threats coming. So Into the Story plays perfectly with what we're trying to do, and it's probably one of the best card draw spells we can get if we're in a dedicated mill deck. Our second key card is going to be Sir Conrad the Grim, which is another win condition in this deck. So Sir Conrad the Grim, 3 black for a legendary creature human knight, 5/4. Whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you can pay 1 in a black, so there's that instant speed interaction we were talking about. And each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. So Sir Conrad doesn't really care about mill himself. It's 2 mana, each player mills 1 card. That's not super great. But the key part of this is whenever any creature goes into a graveyard, including from the library, each opponent takes 1 damage. So if we mill everybody for 1 with Sir Conrad, and all 4 players, assuming we're in a 4-player game, mill over 1 creature, Sir Conrad deals 4 damage to each opponent. That is an insane rate. And when we combine this with cards like Fleet Swallower to mill a target opponent for 40 or 30 cards, there's a good chance we can just knock people out of the game with Sir Conrad almost out of nowhere. So Sir Conrad is a phenomenal backup win condition. If we can't quite mill our opponents completely out, he at least lets us do the damage and get through any final blows to close out the game. And then, finally, our third key card for the deck is Dredge the Mire. So Dredge the Mire is a bit of a pet card of mine. I think it's very good, but I don't see it played super often. So Dredge the Mire is 3 and a black for a sorcery that says each opponent chooses a creature card in their graveyard, put those cards onto the battlefield under your control. Now, I know a lot of the feedback I get from this card when I usually play it is that it's not good because it lets the opponents choose the creature. But the important thing to remember here is that this is 4 mana, assuming we're in a 4-player game, 4 mana to reanimate 3 creatures. That is an insane rate. Even if each opponent gives us something like, say, a Llanowar Elf, that's still 4 mana, get 3 free creatures, and then each of those creatures now gives us an additional mana. And that's the worst case scenario. There will definitely be times where one opponent has nothing but really good creatures in their graveyard. Plus, we do have some ways of exiling specific cards out of our opponent's graveyard, so if we see something we want, we can just exile everything that's not that creature, forcing our opponents to give us the card that we want. So Dredge the Mire, I think, is very underplayed. I think it's very powerful, especially considering it only costs 4 mana, and worst case scenario, considering we're milling our opponents a lot, we get 3 mediocre creatures for 4 mana, which is still a very good rate. So I'm a big fan of Dredge the Mire. I think more people should play it, especially if you're in a mill deck. But those are our key cards. And the next piece of this, if you've seen the show before, you know what's coming, is we need to take a look at some cool interactions in the deck. This is where we're going to take a look at some cards that work incredibly well together and highlight some cards that I think just synergize with our theme super, super well. So the first of those is going to be Maddening Cacophony and Fraying Sanity. So Maddening Cacophony is 1 in a blue for a sorcery with kicker 3 in a blue. Each opponent mills 8 cards. If this spell was kicked, instead each opponent mills half their library rounded up. Now, overall, this is a pretty good card. Even just for 1 in a blue, each opponent mills 8 cards. If, again, we're assuming a 4-player game, we have 3 other opponents, that's milling 24 cards right there for 1 and a blue. That is very, very good. If we're able to kick it, so for 6 mana, each opponent mills half of their library rounded up, is an absolutely crazy rate. That's the kind of thing that wins us games. And if we partner that up with Fraying Sanity, which is 2 in a blue for an enchantment or a curse, it has to enchant a specific player, which is the only major downside to this. But it says at the beginning of each end step, enchanted player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of cards put into that graveyard from anywhere this turn. So in other words, if we cast Fraying Sanity on an opponent, and then we kick a Maddening Cacophony, we are able to mill every opponent for half of their library. Then we move to end step, and the player with Fraying Sanity has to mill a number of cards equal to the number of cards they already milled, which was half their library rounded up. So which means these 2 cards combined knock a player out of the game. This mills their entire library for only only 9 mana, which is a lot, but you don't have to play them both on the same turn. This can also be combined, Fraying Sanity, of course, can also be combined with the Fleet Swallower that we talked about earlier. There's a few other cards in here that do very similar things. So Fraying Sanity, definitely an all-star in this deck. And Maddening Cacophony, again, a personal favorite of mine. If you haven't seen our kicker video, Maddening Cacophony played a phenomenal part in that as well. So I highly recommend you check that out. But moving into our second cool interaction, we have another backup win condition for this deck because this is actually a 2-card infinite combo. And we have Duskmantle Guildmage for blue and black. It's a human wizard, 2/2. You can pay 1 blue, black. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere this turn, that player loses 1 life. Or 2 blue, black. Target player puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So, not super great. We can pay 3 mana. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard, they lose a life. And then we can activate it again to mill someone for 2, losing 2 life. Yeah, pretty decent. But it really shines when we partner that up with Mindcrank. Mindcrank is a 2-mana artifact that says whenever an opponent loses life, that player puts that many cards from the top of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So, if we wanted to play these both and activate them on the same turn, we would still only be spending 7 mana. 7 mana to win the game is pretty good. So, the way that this works, though, is we have Duskmantle Guildmage, we have Mindcrank. If we activate Duskmantle Guildmage, whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere this turn, they lose a life. Then, all we have to do is mill an opponent or hit an opponent. Because if we mill an opponent, they lose a life because a card went into their graveyard, which triggers Mindcrank. Since they milled a card, they lose 1 life, which triggers Duskmantle Guildmage. Since they milled a card, they lose a life. And this repeats infinitely, milling our opponents out, or if they're not dead by the time that they're milled out, then they just lose the game anyway. So they either die to the damage from Mindcrank, or they die from the milling from Duskmantle Guildmage. So an infinite combo that does need a little bit of setup because, like I said, you do have to hit an opponent or force them to mill to start the combo. And this does only kill 1 player, so you have to make sure that each opponent is going to be able to take a little bit of damage or mill a card. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get everybody in one go. But I will say, too, this combination of cards is pretty well known from what I've seen. A lot of people, if you drop one of these cards onto the table without the other, knows what's coming and will probably remove it. So be very aware if you're playing this deck that these 2 cards can draw a little bit of hate when they come down. But those are our cool interactions. And since this is a budget show, we of course got to talk about the budget. So this week, our deck came in at $97.44, so pretty darn close to our budget limit of $100. And our most expensive card may be unsurprising to people who have played mill decks before, but it's actually Leyline of the Void. And Leyline of the Void is 2 black for an enchantment. If Leyline of the Void is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. If a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So yeah, this shuts off some of our main synergies in the deck. It shuts off things like our Nighthawk Scavenger, things like that. But the key to mill decks is we gotta make sure that our opponent's libraries actually stay gone. And there are way too many cards in Commander that shuffle someone's graveyard back into their library. We can't win if our opponents are doing that, so we have to make sure we have ways of getting rid of graveyards. Leyline of the Void doesn't exile cards that are already in the graveyard, but once it's on the battlefield, if we mill over anything, those cards are gone for good. That allows us a lot of leeway because our opponents can't shuffle that back into their library. If we can't still win after that, then, we did the best that we could. Now, There are other cards that do the same thing. We do have an Ashiok in the deck as well, who also exiles graveyards. There are some small artifacts that exile graveyards as well. So Leyline of the Void is not a necessary piece, but it is a very powerful piece because you can start with it in play if you have it in your opening hand. So I do highly recommend Leyline of the Void if you are able to get one into the deck, or if you don't mind splurging a little bit. But if you are looking to cut the price of the deck down closer to about $90, this is a card you can cut and replace with maybe an artifact that deals with graveyards instead. So that is our total deck for the week. However, if you are looking to maybe upgrade the deck a little bit or increase the budget for some reason, maybe you just want to, I do have one card that I would like to suggest for our out-of-budget upgrades section of this deck. And it's a card that I'm a big fan of myself, and it is very powerful in mill decks, but again, draws a lot of hate, and that is Bruvak the Grandiloquent. Bruvak is 2 and a blue for a legendary creature human advisor. He's a 1/4. And he says, if an opponent would mill one or more cards, they mill twice that many cards instead. So Bruvak literally just doubles up all of our mill cards in the deck. This turns things like our Fleet Swallower into one-shot kills, because Fleet Swallower will mill you for half of your deck rounded up, doubled, which is your entire deck, so you just die. So Bruvak is incredibly powerful, especially if you can get something that mills half of someone's library on board ready to use, then cast Bruvak and just knock people out. But like I said, because people don't like to be milled, they really don't like to be milled double. So Bruvak does draw a lot of hate. So if you are thinking about adding this to the deck, I would just be aware of that. But at least it's not in the command zone, so it can't draw hate that way. But that is the only out-of-budget upgrade we have this week. So the next thing we're going to have to do is, of course, see how this deck actually plays. So we are going to jump into a game with 3 opponents this week. And in this case, we have Edgar Charmed Groom being played by Jason, Emil the Blessed being played by Bilal, and Obeka Brute Chronologist being played by Shawn. So Jason's Edgar deck is an Orzhov Vampire Tribal deck that focuses very heavily on sacrificing, because Edgar is going to give other vampires +1/+1, and then when it dies, it transforms into Edgar Markov's Coffin, which at the beginning of your upkeep makes a 1/1 white and black vampire creature token with lifelink, puts a counter on the coffin, and then when there are 3 or more counters on it, you remove it and transform it. So it pumps his vampires, it makes more vampires, and it's just an interesting commander. I've never seen an Orzhov vampire deck, so I'm very excited to see what this one does. Although Jason's specialty is aristocrats, so I am a little worried about that aspect of the deck. Next up, we have Bilal and his Emil the Blessed deck. This is not a unicorn tribal deck, I'm sad to say. It's a Selesnya Blink value style deck, so he wants to play as many creatures with enter the battlefield triggers as possible and get as much value from them as he can. Since this is a value pile from Bilal, I will say I am a little worried that there may be an infinite combo in store for us, so we'll see how that goes. Hopefully we can kind of mill out the combo if possible. And then finally, we have Shawn in his Obeka Brute Chronologist deck. I'm a big fan of Obeka. We've actually done an Obeka deck on this channel before, so if you're interested, please do check that out. But Obeka wants to end the turn. So Shawn is playing with a ton of cards that have really great effects, but may have a huge downside at the end of your turn. So that way he can go put the triggers on the stack, end the turn, and he gets all the upside with none of the downsides. It's also an interesting political piece too, because Obeka mentions that the player whose turn it is may end the turn. So if maybe someone's about to die, Shawn could extend an olive branch and say, hey, you can end the turn if you want, so you can stay in the game and then move on to someone else. It's probably not very likely that that happens, but I do like that that is an aspect of Obeka, so I did want to toss that in there. So I'm interested to see how this game goes. Hopefully we can mill our opponents out, but I hope you enjoy the game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by Bilal, Shawn, and then myself. Before the game starts, I'm able to begin with Leyline of the Void in play since I had it in my opening hand. This exiles any cards that would go to my opponent's graveyards. Then, on Jason's first turn, he plays Memorial to Folly. Bilal plays a Thriving Grove, naming white so that it taps for both of his colors. Shawn plays a Training Center. I play a Swamp. Jason plays a Plains and casts Talisman of Hierarchy, followed up by a Quag Vampires. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Arcane Signet. Shawn plays an Island and casts Mind Stone. I float a black mana and play a Dimir Aqueduct, returning the swamp to hand, and then use the black mana to cycle a Barren Moor. Jason plays a Shattered Sanctum and casts his commander, Edgar Charmed Groom, giving his other vampires +1/+1, and attacks me for 2. Bilal plays a Plains and casts Elite Spellbinder, looking at Shawn's hand and choosing to exile a Windfall from it, making it cost 2 more to cast. Shawn plays a Swamp, and then casts Solemn Simulacrum, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. I play a Myriad Landscape and pass. Jason plays a Plains, and then casts Legion's Lieutenant, giving his vampires an additional +1/+1, and then attacks me for 5 with Edgar and Shawn for 3. Then in his second main phase, he casts Queen's Commission, making 2 1/1 vampire tokens with lifelink. Bilal plays an Overgrown Farmland and casts his commander, Emil the Blessed. Shawn plays a Swamp, and then casts his commander, Obeka Brute Chronologist. After that, he casts a Talisman of Creativity. On my turn, I play a Swamp and pass. Jason plays a Fetid Heath, and then attacks me for 9, Shawn for 3, and Bilal for 5 with Edgar. Before the damage, I cast Swift End to destroy Legion Lieutenant, losing 2 life, but only taking 4 from Jason, while Shawn takes 2, Bilal takes 4, and Jason gains 4. Then, in Jason's second main phase, he casts Indulging Patrician, making it so each opponent loses 3 life on his end step if he gained 3 or more life on his turn, which does happen this turn, and he passes. Bilal plays a Forest and passes. Shawn casts Avaricious Dragon, drawing an additional card at the start of his turns and discarding his hand at the end of his turn. Then, in his end step, with the dragon's trigger on the stack, he activates Obeka to end his turn. I play a Swamp and cast my commander, Mirko Vosk Mind Drinker. Jason plays a Plains, and then attacks me for 4 with Edgar and Shawn for 2 with Swamp Walk. Before the damage, however, Bilal casts Sigrid Godfavored to exile Edgar until Sigrid leaves the battlefield. This means that Shawn takes 1 while I take no damage. On Bilal's turn, he casts Soul's Majesty, drawing 4 cards since he controls a creature with power 4. Then he plays a Gavany Township, and at the end of turn, Shawn sacrifices his Mind Stone to draw a card. In Shawn's upkeep, he draws a card thanks to his Avaricious Dragon, and then plays a Luxury Suite, and casts Preordain, scrying 2 and drawing a card. After that, he casts Jeska's Will, making 7 red mana since Bilal has 7 cards in hand, and exiling the top 3 cards of his library, being able to play them this turn. This has him revealing Thassa's Oracle, Apprentice Necromancer, and Steam Vents. He then casts a Dockside Extortionist, making 3 treasures when it enters, casts Thassa's Oracle, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, putting 1 into his hand and the others on the bottom of his deck, casts Apprentice Necromancer, and casts Ilharg the Razeboar. Finally, in his end step, he ends the turn with his commander Obeka while the Avaricious Dragon's trigger is on the stack, keeping his hand. I play a swamp, and then cast Mind Funeral, targeting Jason and milling him until he hits 4 land cards. Jason recasts his commander Edgar, and then attacks me for 2 with Swamp Walk. On Bilal's turn, he casts Charming Prince, scrying 2 when it enters, and passes. Shawn draws a card in his upkeep for Avaricious Dragon, and then in his draw step, Bilal casts Ephemerate to exile Obeka and return her to play under its owner's control. Unfortunately, he couldn't have done this since Ephemerate only targets creatures the caster controls, but we don't catch that at the time. In response, Shawn decides to activate Obeka to end the turn. And in response to that trigger, I sacrifice my Myriad Landscape to search my library for 2 islands and put them into play tapped. Then on my turn, I play a Field of Ruin and cast Whisper Silk Cloak. I then equip Whisper Silk Cloak to Mirko Vosk, giving him Shroud and Unblockable. This allows me to attack Bilal for 2, and when Bilal has to take the 2 damage, he mills until he hits 4 land cards. Jason moves straight to combat, attacking me for 12 and Shawn for 2 with Swamp Walk, while Jason gains 4. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Cruel Celebrant, which drains each opponent for 1 whenever any of his creatures die. After that, he casts a Lend to the Duskrose, getting a +1/+1 counter when another creature dies, and creates X vampire tokens when it dies equal to its power. At the end of turn, Bilal activates Emil to exile Charming Prince and return it to play, scrying 2, and then everybody takes 3 from the Patrician. Bilal casts a Kodama's Reach, searching for 2 basic lands, and then at the end of turn, Shawn casts Vampiric Tutor, searching his library for a card, putting it on top. Then on Shawn's turn, he casts a Rakshasa Debaser, which returns a creature from the graveyard to play when it attacks, and attacks Jason for 10, triggering Ilharg and putting Jin-Jitaxis Core Augur into play, tapped and attacking Jason as well. Before damage, Bilal activates Emil to exile Sigrid and return her to play, exiling Jin-Jitaxis until she leaves play. Then Jason takes 10 damage. In Shawn's second main phase, he casts Brain Freeze to mill Bilal for 3, and, since it has Storm, copies it to mill him for another 3. Then at the end of turn, Shawn chooses not to activate Obeka, discarding his hand, which is just 1 land, to Avaricious Dragon. I play an island and cast Murderous Rider, and cast Mindcrank, forcing each opponent to mill a card for each damage they take. Jason casts Anguished Unmaking to exile Leyline of the Void, but, unfortunately... Jason. I don't think you said please, I'm sorry.
Beautiful, sir. Beautiful.
Now you have to die.
That's fair. I counter it with Didn't Say Please, milling Jason for 3. He then casts Cordial Vampire, putting a +1/+1 counter on all his vampires when a creature dies, and then moves to combat, attacking me for 2 with Swamp Walk. Bilal casts Rishkar's Expertise, drawing 4 cards and putting Thragtusk into play, gaining 5 life. He then plays a Plains and casts Wood Elves, searching his library for a forest and putting it into play. He uses that forest to help him cast Rampant Growth, searching his library for yet another basic land and putting it into play tapped. In Shawn's upkeep, he draws a card thanks to his dragon, and then casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards and putting 2 from his hand on top of his library. After that, he plays a Thawing Glaciers, and casts Windfall from Exile, forcing each player to discard their hand and then draw 6 cards, since Bilal has 6 cards in hand. At the end of turn, Shawn activates his commander Obeka, so he doesn't have to discard his newly acquired hand. I play a command tower and cast King Narfi's Betrayal, milling each player for 4 and allowing me to exile Jace Beleren from my own graveyard. I then go to combat, attacking Shawn for 2, milling him for 2 with Mindcrank, and also milling him until he hits 4 land cards. Jason plays a Plains, and then moves to combat, attacking me for 12 with his entire board. I decide to block Edgar, taking 8 and gaining 2, killing my Murderous Rider, while Jason gains 4, putting me down to only 1 life. Then in Jason's second main phase, he casts Orzhov's Signet, and casts Vindictive Vampire, draining each opponent for 1 whenever another one of his creatures dies. Then at the end of turn, Indulgent Patrician triggers, doing 3 damage to each opponent, knocking me out of the game. On Bilal's turn, he casts a Wall of Omens, drawing a card, and then passes. In Shawn's upkeep, he draws an additional card from Avaricious Dragon, and then casts Narset, Parter of Veils. In response, Bilal activates Emil to exile Wall of Omens, returning it to play and drawing a card. Shawn then activates Narset's -2 ability to look at the top 4 cards of his library, putting a non-land, non-creature card to hand. This has him putting a Lightning Greaves into his hand. After that, he casts Solve the Equation, searching his library for an instant or sorcery and putting it into his hand. This has him finding a Blasphemous Act, and he quickly moves to combat, deciding to attack Jason for 10, triggering Ilharg, and putting Anger into play, attacking Jason for another 2. After that, he activates Thawing Glaciers, searching his library and putting a basic land into play tapped. Then he activates Obeka, so he doesn't have to return the Glaciers or Anger to hand, or discard his hand to his dragon. Jason casts a Forerunner of the Legion, searching his library for a vampire and putting it on top of his deck. This also gives target creature +1/+1 whenever he has a vampire enter under his control. This lets him put Viscera Seer on top of his library. He then sacrifices Orzhov Cluestone to draw a card, and casts Viscera Seer, allowing him to sacrifice a creature to scry 1, giving Quag Vampires +1/+1. He then plays a Swamp, and attacks Shawn for 3 with Swamp Walk. At the end of turn, Bilal activates Emil, targeting Wood Elves to search his library for another forest, putting it into play. At this point, we also realize that Jason couldn't have drawn the Viscera Seer because of Narset, so he puts it back on top of his library, brings back his Cluestone, and Shawn loses 1 less life from the attack. Then, once Bilal gets his forest, he repeats the process 2 more times, activating Emil, targeting Wood Elves, and searching his library for another 2 forests, putting them into play. On Bilal's turn, he casts Kogla the Titan Ape, fighting Elenda when he enters the battlefield, killing Jason's vampire and putting a +1/+1 counter on all his other vampires, draining each opponent for 2 life and making 2 1/1 vampire tokens. In Shawn's upkeep, he draws an extra card for turn, and then activates Narset's -2 ability, looking at the top 4 cards of his library and putting Sol Ring into his hand. He then plays an island and casts the Sol Ring, followed up by casting a Talisman of Indulgence and a Rakdos Signet. Finally, casts a Flame Shadow Conjuring, allowing him to pay a red mana whenever a non-token creature enters under his control to make a token copy of it that gets exiled at the next end step. After that, he moves to combat, attacking Jason with everything except his commander Obeka. This triggers Ilharg, and he puts Itali Primal Storm into play, also attacking Jason, and also triggers Rakshasa Debaser, allowing Shawn to put Elenda the Dusk Rose into play under his control from Jason's graveyard. However, in response, Jason sacrifices his Memorial to Folly, returning Elenda to his hand so that Shawn can't take her. After that, Jason blocks as much as he can with his vampires, and this results in him taking 7 damage, gaining 15 life, losing 4 vampires, which makes each opponent lose a total of 8 damage, while Jason gains 8, and also puts 4 +1/+1 counters on the rest of his vampires. Then Jason sacrifices his clue stone to draw a card, and at the end of turn, Bilal activates Emil, targeting Kogla, to exile him and return him to play, paying an additional 1 so that he comes back with a +1/+1 counter. This allows him to fight Jason's Cruel Celebrant, and Bilal also returns Charming Prince to his hand with Kogla's ability, giving the ape indestructible. This kills the Celebrant, draining each of Jason's opponents for 2, and putting 1 more +1/+1 counter on each of his vampires. At this point, Shawn also forgets to activate Obeka, but he means to do so that he doesn't discard his hand or lose a tally. On Jason's turn, he casts Viscera Seer, but with it on the stack, Shawn casts Discontinuity to end Jason's turn, exiling the Viscera Seer. Bilal casts an Aura Shards, allowing him to destroy an artifact or enchantment whenever a creature enters under his control, and then recast Charming Prince, gaining 3 life and destroying Flame Shadow Conjuring. Shawn draws an extra card in his upkeep, plays an island, and casts Dimir Signet, followed by Lightning Greaves. He then moves to combat, attacking Jason with the Rakshasa Debaser and Itali, triggering both of them. This allows Shawn to put Jason's Cruel Celebrant into play under his control, and also reveals the top card of everyone's library, allowing Shawn to cast End-Raze Forerunners for free, giving all of his creatures +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. Jason then blocks with his Indulgent Patrician, trying to gain 8 life, but Shawn decides to end the turn with Obeka before combat damage can be dealt. Jason recasts Alenda the Dusk Rose, and then casts Drana, Liberator of Malakir. Both of these trigger the Forerunner, giving the Patrician +2/+2 until end of turn. He then attacks Shawn for 8 with Swamp Walk, and Bilal for 13 in the air. Before blocks, Bilal flashes in Restoration Angel to exile Sigrid God-Favored and return her to play. This returns Jin-Gitaxias to play under Shawn's control and exiles Jason's Patrician, also destroying both of Jason's artifacts. This still isn't enough to save Shawn though, and he gets knocked out of the game. Then, in Jason's second main phase, he plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1, and at the end of turn, Bilal activates Emil 3 times, targeting Wood Elves to search his library for 3 forests, putting them into play. On Bilal's turn, he casts Luminate Primordial, exiling Cordial Vampire and gaining Jason 8 life since it had 8 power. Then, with Emil, Bilal is able to exile the Primordial and return it to play 4 more times, exiling everything on Jason's board except Edgar and Drana, gaining Jason a total of 28 life. At this point, Jason knows Bilal can do that every turn, so he decides to concede, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a pretty sweet game. Unfortunately, we really didn't get to do too much. Our turn 0 leyline, which I probably kept the hand just because it had the leyline, it didn't have much else, unfortunately. I think that leyline wound up getting us killed because Jason really needed his aristocrats to go off, so he was just going to keep attacking us until we died, especially once I made sure to counter his spell when he didn't say please. He was not very impressed with that one, but I thought it was funny, so I will count that as a win in my books. Otherwise, I think Jason's deck was very impressive. I do think that his vampire strategies, along with the aristocrats, could have definitely gotten there. I think Bilal's Primordial at the end really sealed the deal, but if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have been surprised to see Jason win pretty soon after. But I was very impressed with Bilal's deck, being able to blink a ton of creatures and cards. His Wood Elves was kind of like the MVP for the game. I think over the course of the game, he got 5 or 6 forests total off of it, which is very impressive. But considering he only cast 2 real ramp spells, he still wound up with a ton more lands than the rest of us. And then Shawn's Obeka deck, I'm a huge fan. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge fan of Obeka, and I think Shawn's build is very powerful. He did mention toward the end that he was also a bit of a graveyard deck. We saw that a little bit with like Rakshasa Debaser, But he also was shut down pretty hard from what he mentioned by my Leyline of the Void, so we didn't get to see the true power I think that his deck could have brought, and I think that if he had been unshackled from the graveyard synergies early on, he could have been way ahead in that game, because even losing at the end, it looked like he was very close to winning. So a very good showing, I think, by everybody's decks. Unfortunately, ours not so much, but we still got to mill every player with the Mirko Vosk trigger, which is pretty sweet. And again, I'll take that as a win. So I hope you all enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. Hope you enjoyed the gameplay. If you have any suggestions for future videos that you would like to see or cards you would like to see built around, please do let me know. And as always, it does not have to be a legendary creature. It could be any card. I'm happy to build around anything, but legendary creatures are always fun as well. So please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.